Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of the Philippine military
Ooh.
and how it interacts with society. It's
Okay.
a really fascinating story of power struggles, political maneuvering,
Right.
and these insurgencies that just seem to keep popping up.
Yeah.
And get this, it's all wrapped up in this like 40-year cycle of militarization,
Wow.
demilitarization, and then bam, remilitarization all over again.
Wow.
You sent us this article by Renato Cruz de Castro called The Cycle of Militarization, Demilitarization, and Remilitarization in the Early 21st Century Philippine Society.
Okay.
And we're going to break it all down.
It's a really interesting case study because you've got the Philippines, which on one hand has the strong democratic tradition,
Right.
a really vibrant civil society.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, the military keeps finding itself right in the middle of political and social life.
Yeah, it's like that friend who just always seems to be at the center of the drama.
Right in the thick of it.
But how did it get that way? The article starts with a pretty intense story, actually.
Oh, are you talking about the suicide of Angela Thomas Reyes?
Yeah, the former Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief of Staff
Right.
and Defense Secretary.
Yeah.
It's not something you forget easily. You know,
Yeah.
this high-ranking official taking his own life after being accused of corruption.
Right. It was a huge scandal.
For sure.
But the article argues that it really exposed something deeper going on, this
Right.
like pervasive influence of the military in Philippine society.
Makes you wonder how that kind of corruption was even possible in a democracy.
It's a great question.
Right. They have elections,
Yeah.
a Congress, a president.
You'd think there'd be more checks and balances, right?
So how does the military keep ending up with so much power?
Well, it's like the Philippines is constantly stuck in this tug of war.
Okay.
On one side, you have these democratic institutions,
Yeah.
but then the military's influence is always kind of pushing the boundaries of civilian control.
So they're trying to balance on a tightrope.
Exactly. And speaking of tricky terms, maybe we should define a few things before we go any further.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So we have militarization, demilitarization, and remilitarization.
Those are some mouthful words.
I know, right? But think of them as like processes, not just fixed states.
Processes. Okay.
Yeah. And the article mentions this idea of a garrison state.
Garrison state.
Yeah, imagine a country where the military, even though they're not officially in charge,
Right.
they hold a ton of sway.
Like they're always lurking in the shadows.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's not like a black and white situation
No.
where they're either in control or completely hands off.
Right. It's more of a spectrum.
A spectrum. Okay.
And the Philippines has been going back and forth on that spectrum for decades.
Wow.
Now, one major factor driving this whole cycle, and this is where it gets really interesting,
Okay.
is the Philippines' struggle with these internal security threats.
You mean those rebel groups and insurgencies we always hear about?
Exactly. Ever since gaining independence in 1946,
Right.
the Philippines has been dealing with these challenges.
Like what?
Well, you've got groups like the Hukbalahap Rebellion back in the 40s and 50s.
Right.
And later on, the communist insurgency led by the New People's Army, or the NPA.
And don't forget the secessionist movements in Mindanao,
Oh, right.
the Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF, and then later the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF.
So many acronyms.
It's like alphabet soup over there.
It is a lot to keep track of.
But the main point is that instead of focusing on external threats,
Yeah.
like defending their borders, the military has been super preoccupied with these internal struggles.
It's like they're constantly on edge, always looking over their shoulder.
So they're always fighting fires at home instead of looking outward.
Exactly. And that inward focus has had a huge impact on the military's role and power in the Philippines.
I could see how that would be the case.
Yeah.
If you're constantly battling internal threats, you need a strong military. And that can lead to them taking on a bigger role in society.
It's a vicious cycle.
So the article, it goes into the specific strategies that the armed forces of the Philippines
AFP.
developed to tackle these insurgencies.
Yes.
What did they come up with?
Well, one strategy was called Lambat Batag, which means fishing net in Tagalog. They would deploy these special operations teams to villages that were controlled by communist insurgents.
Wow.
And use a combination of psychological operations, military force, and territorial security measures to try to weaken the insurgents.
Sounds intense.
It was, and it did have some success.
Okay.
But here's where things get really interesting, and this is important for understanding the cycle.
Right.
As part of their efforts, the AFP also engaged in what they called civic action programs.
Civic action program.
Yeah, things like building schools and infrastructure, providing health care.
Wait a minute. Those sound like things the civilian government should be doing.
Exactly.
Not the military.
You're right, and that's a key point the article brings up.
Okay.
By taking on these roles, the military was really blurring the lines
Interesting.
between their traditional duties and the responsibilities of the civilian government.
So they're fighting insurgents and building schools at the same time?
Yeah, it's almost like they were acting as a shadow government in these conflict zones.
That's a great way to put it.
And that's how this cycle of militarization starts to take root.
Now it's starting to click.
Yeah.
You can see how over time, this constant focus on internal security and the blurring of roles could lead to a much more powerful military with deeper roots in society.
Precisely. And the article traces this whole cycle all the way back to Ferdinand Marcos's imposition of martial law in 1972.
Ah, the Marcos era.
Yeah.
Not exactly the Philippines' finest hour.
No, not really.
What impact did martial law have on the military?
Well, under Marcos, the AFP's manpower and budget just exploded.
Exploded, wow.
He used them for everything: counterinsurgency, civic action missions, even running government corporations.
So he basically put the military on steroids.
Yeah, pretty much.
But here's a thought. Even though they were heavily involved in every part of life during martial law, Marcos kept them on a tight leash.
He did. It's interesting.
So a highly militarized society, but under the control of a civilian dictator.
That's right.
So what happened when the People Power Revolution ousted Marcos in '86 and Corazon Aquino became president?
Ah, Cory Aquino.
She was a symbol of democracy, right?
Yes, she was.
A fierce critic of Marcos.
And she made demilitarization a key part of her presidency.
Okay, so a total 180 from the Marcos era.
You could say that.
But I have a feeling it wasn't that simple.
You're right to be skeptical, because despite her efforts, there were actually multiple coup attempts against her administration.
Really? Wow.
It was a clear sign that the military still held a lot of power and that civilian control was fragile.
So even with a popular Democratic leader in charge, the military was still flexing its muscles, trying to regain its political foothold?
It's like they were always waiting in the wings for their chance to step back in.
So this cycle, it just keeps repeating.
Yep, and we'll get into all of that right after this.
So we left off with Corazon Aquino and her push to roll back the military's power.
Yeah, to demilitarize.
But they didn't exactly give up without a fight, right?
Not really, no.
And history kind of has a way of repeating itself, you know?
It does.
Fast forward to the early 2000s.
Okay.
We've got Gloria Macapagal Arroyo coming into power.
Right, after President Estrada was ousted.
Yeah, another people power uprising.
It's a recurring theme in Philippine politics.
It really is.
And Arroyo, she kind of did what Marcos did before her.
Okay.
She leaned heavily on the military to keep things stable.
And to stay in power, right?
Well, let's just say she recognized their usefulness.
So she's basically fueling the resurgence of the military.
In a way, yes.
By using them for her own political survival.
She appointed former military officers to important positions and gave the AFP a big role in developing national security strategies.
So they were calling the shots.
Not entirely, but they had a lot of influence. And according to De Castro, this remilitarization had some pretty big consequences.
For Philippine politics?
Yeah.
What kind of consequence?
Well, for one thing, having the AFP so involved in internal security created this potential for what we call a garrison state.
A garrison state? What's that?
It's where the military holds a lot of political power.
Even if they're not officially running the government?
Exactly.
Sounds kind of scary, like a step towards authoritarianism.
It can be, yeah.
And what else?
Well, being so exposed to the government
Yeah.
led to some disillusionment within the military.
They saw how things really worked.
They saw the corruption, the incompetence.
Oh, so they started thinking they could do a better job.
Some of them, yes.
That's not good.
No, it creates this dangerous dynamic.
Where they see themselves as the only competent ones.
Right, and that's a threat to any democracy.
But thankfully, De Castro also points out some factors that kept the military in check.
Oh, good.
What were they?
Well, for one, the military itself knew its limitations.
When it came to actually governing?
Yeah, they weren't politicians.
They knew their strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
Okay, what else?
Well, the Philippines still had other powerful institutions.
Like the Congress and the courts.
Exactly. They could push back against the military.
They would just roll over.
And then there's civil society.
Right. The Philippines has a long history of activism.
And a free press.
So they could mobilize against a military takeover.
They'd be out in the streets.
Powerful stuff.
It is. And then there's the international factor.
After countries.
Especially the U.S.
Right. They've got a long history with the Philippines.
They wouldn't have been happy with a military coup.
So all these factors, internal and external,
combine to keep the military from going too far.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It is, but it was still a period of remilitarization.
And that had its downsides, right?
Definitely.
Like what?
Well, there were more human rights abuses.
Oh, no.
Less space for dissent.
And the military felt like they could get away with anything.
Pretty much.
That's stark.
It was a difficult time.
But De Castro also mentions a potential turning point.
Yes, he does.
Under President Benigno Aquino III.
Cory Aquino's son.
They started shifting the AFP's focus.
From internal security to territorial defense.
Because of China.
Exactly. China was becoming more assertive in the South China Sea.
That's a big change.
It is.
From fighting insurgents to facing a superpower.
A real challenge.
And that could change the cycle of militarization.
It had the potential to.
How so?
Well, focusing on external threats could mean less military involvement in domestic politics.
Okay, less meddling.
And they had to modernize to meet this new threat.
New equipment, new strategies.
It could lead to a more professional military culture.
Less likely to get involved in politics.
In theory, yes.
So a glimmer of hope.
There was, but did it actually work?
That's the big question, right?
It is.
What were the results of this new strategy?
Well, they did start taking the AFP modernization law seriously.
They actually funded it.
They did. They invested in new equipment.
Especially for the Navy and the Air Force.
Right. They needed to be able to defend their maritime borders.
So they were finally getting the tools they needed.
They were. But it wasn't just about equipment.
What else?
They also implemented this new internal security plan.
Oh, Plan Bayanihan, right?
Yes. It means community spirit.
It's a beautiful word.
It is, and it reflects the idea that the military can't solve everything on its own.
They need to work with others.
Exactly. They need to address the root causes of conflict.
Like poverty and inequality.
Those are big factors.
So it's not just about fighting, it's about building a better society.
That was the idea.
And they also wanted to negotiate with the rebel groups.
They saw that as the only long-term solution.
So the military's role was to pressure them to negotiate.
Not necessarily to defeat them.
A big shift in thinking.
It was a more nuanced approach.
Combining security, development, and diplomacy.
A three-pronged attack.
Did work.
Well, it's complicated.
Come on, you can't leave us hanging. What were some of the successes and setbacks? So we're talking about this new approach to security in the Philippines, recognizing that they need to address the root causes of these conflicts.
Right, a more holistic view.
What were some of the things that Aquino's administration actually achieved?
Well, they really started making headway with that AFP modernization law.
They actually put money behind it.
They did.
Wow.
They made some serious investments in new equipment.
Which is a huge deal considering how long the military had been neglected.
It was a long time coming.
Especially for the Navy and the Air Force.
Yeah, those were key for territorial defense.
Makes sense. So they're finally getting the tools they need.
It was a good start.
But it's not just about equipment, right?
No, of course not.
They also had Oplan Bayanihan.
That's right. That was all about taking a more collaborative approach to internal security.
So working with communities, trying to address the root causes of conflict.
Exactly.
And they pushed for those negotiated settlements with the rebel groups, too.
Yeah, they saw that as the only real long-term solution.
So it's like they were trying to shift the military's mindset away from just fighting all the time.
It was a big cultural shift.
To something more sustainable in the long run.
That was the hope.
But that kind of change, it's not easy.
No, especially in an institution like the military.
With such a long history of being involved in politics.
It's hard to break those habits.
Were there any, setbacks along the way?
Oh, definitely. Well, even with the best intentions, fully modernizing the military was still a huge challenge.
Yeah, they had a lot of catching up to do.
A lot.
And it's expensive.
It is. So even if they had the will, sometimes the resources just weren't there.
So that's one obstacle.
And remember, all this is happening while they're also dealing with China's growing presence in the South China Sea.
Oh, right. That adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to balance internal security with territorial defense.
Exactly. And on top of that, they have to worry about how China's going to react to everything they do.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is.
So what does all of this mean for the future of the Philippines? Like, did Aquino's efforts actually break this cycle of militarization?
Well, it's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
The Aquino administration, they definitely made some progress.
They did.
And that shift toward territorial defense, it seemed to have a positive impact.
Okay.
But whether it's a lasting change, well, only time will tell.
So they're not out of the woods yet?
Not entirely. This cycle, it's deeply ingrained in their political system.
It's like a pattern that keeps repeating.
It is, but their experience does offer some valuable lessons for other countries.
What kind of lessons?
Well, for one, it shows how important a strong civil society is.
For protecting democracy.
Exactly.
Okay.
An engaged citizenry, a free press.
Like a watchdog, keeping an eye on things.
They can really help keep the military in check.
That makes sense.
And another big lesson is the importance of civilian control over the military.
Making sure they answer to the elected government.
Exactly. Things like strong oversight mechanisms.
Right. Transparency in their budget.
Holding them accountable for any abuses.
So basically, building safeguards to prevent the military from becoming too powerful.
That's the idea.
And making sure they stay in their lane.
That's a good way to put it.
It's not just about having rules on paper, though, right?
No, it's also about creating a culture of respect.
Within the military.
Yes. They need to see themselves as serving the state.
Not ruling it.
Exactly. A sense of duty, loyalty to the Constitution.
To democratic values.
That kind of transformation takes time.
And effort.
And a real commitment from everyone involved.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
We've learned so much about the Philippines.
It's a fascinating case study.
From the history of militarization to the challenges of balancing internal and external threats.
It's complex.
Really complex.
But it highlights some universal truths about power and democracy.
And the importance of vigilance.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there, what's something you'd like them to think about based on what we've discussed?
I'd say consider the parallels between the Philippines and other democracies around the world.
Okay.
How do other countries deal with the influence of the military? What safeguards do they have in place? What can we learn from the Philippines' successes and failures?
Those are great questions.
It's a conversation worth having.
It really is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating topic.